to start just by acknowledging that while I want to talk about the future of education today and about the future of our children, in order to talk about the future, we need to begin with the past. One of the most common errors we make in thinking about the past is that the progression of history's progression has been inevitable. That ignorance is always followed by enlightenment, eventually. The backward glance of history invariably creates exactly this kind of optical illusion. And therefore we feel no anxiety, no uncertainty when we start to study, say, World War II. Because we know that the good guys will win in the end. History's like a big novel. Most of us haven't read the novel, but we do have access to the last chapter. And we know it's going to turn out okay. We've read the last chapter. And so when we survey history topically, we have the sense that everything's going to turn out okay. The good guys win in the end, and we especially like the way it turns out because the good guys are us. Because we're here, which means we won, which means the novel turns out okay, which means the good guys win in the end, which means history is okay. And it's actually kind of boring because the first group of chapters are irrelevant. I know how they turn out. I'm here. We like the ending because we are the ending. Herbert Butterfield, actually, he looks a lot more boring than he was. Just a terrific, lovely historian who's now passed away. Herbert Butterfield, one of the great 20th century historians, he called what I just described, he called it the Whig interpretation of history, and he called it the Whig fallacy, as in the now defunct Whig political party of the 19th century in England. The Whigs were the party whose political slogans were always about the expansion of individual liberty. That was the main motif of the Whig ideology. The expansion of individual liberty. They liked to draw lines connecting historical events, as though it were the story was inevitable. This thing led to this thing, which led to this thing. Lines were drawn from Martin Luther's 95 Theses in Wittenberg to the abolition of the slave trade to their own day, as if those events causally led from one to the other to the other, and always told their story, their political story, of the expansion of individual liberty. Now, this should sound familiar to you today, to all of us. We know this rhetorical story well from our own time. It is literally history that is being co-opted to advance individual political agendas and political ideologies. And it's this trick, this optical illusion, where things that happen before other things are interpreted as inevitably causing those things and creating these lines of progression. And so we're able to line up 20 different events from the past as though they're dominoes falling over, tipping eventually into our own time. It's called the Whig fallacy. You don't need to know that all that much, but I want you to understand the problem of this fallacy and how it's going to affect what we do in education. Inevitability is, in a lot of educators and a lot of politicians' mind, worked out this way. So causation comes after sequence. So the first thing is it happens before another thing, so sequence. Then we look at that and we say, well, that's causation. The thing that happens before inevitably causes the next thing. And then there's sort of an unstoppable way that we see it. It has to lead to that. And so we start to see that history has, some people have even said, an arc to history. It's sort of, there's a gravitational force making sure that history goes in the right direction. But we have to be confused, and sometimes we have to be even troubled by this. Herbert Butterfield calls it the Whig fallacy. So the problem with this kind of history is that the people who actually lived through the past, did not know how the past would turn out. They lived through it with uncertainty. Think about how you feel today about the future. Do you feel certainty about what will happen in your life next month, in your country next month, in your world next month, next year? If you don't feel certainty about it, then the people from the past didn't feel certainty about what was happening in their world either. They lived in the dark about what was coming, just as you live in the dark about what's coming in the future. So we're in the dark, they're in the dark, which means that they had to make choices without certainty of outcomes. And it is their choices in the past, their free will, their actions, that have given us the world that we have today. Their choice. History wasn't inevitable. People had to make choices to get to where we are today. Now, people who see inevitability in the way that the past has happened often like to talk about laws of history, as if history is like physics, testable and repeatable, and has assured outcomes. Yes, it is a law of physics that water has a certain boiling point. But generals in military conflict do not have specific surrendering points. Marriages do not have hard and fast divorce points. Children do not have maximum levels of potential achievement. There are not laws that can be applied to these things the way that there are laws that can be applied to physics. So when we talk of laws of history, we need to be skeptical. And this is because, again, people have choice, free choice. History always lives on a razor's edge and could go one way or another, depending on what we do, what we choose to do. The winners in any given moment could give us a more wicked world or a more noble one. And the most important factor in determining historical events is not some inevitable force moving history to individual liberty, but individual people making choices that are either good or not good. People like you and me. So it is not a law of history that the systematic extermination of an entire race will automatically be rejected by mainstream, well-educated, middle-class people. It is not a law of history that people like you and me will automatically reject a political ideology that has as its core the annihilation of an entire race. That is not a law of history. People can choose to adopt that outlook and have done. Normal Germans made an evil choice. And it is not a law that when all hope is lost, you must surrender. The general of 100 men at the Alamo wouldn't surrender, even though death was a certainty. And while British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, I'm going to come to this slide in a second. I'm actually going to pause here. The mistake that I want to point out with this particular slide, this is where the lack of PowerPoint skill comes in. So you who are in the English world, the novel people, the story people, you're familiar with this thing. This is a slide that reflects a very commonly understood perception of stories. It's great. It's true. You have the idea of rising action that leads to a climax, falling action, resolution. When you know you're bored in a movie theater when the falling action and the resolution take way too long. The last 45 minutes, we already knew how it turned out. You remember the Lord of the Rings trilogy? You know that feeling at the end where it just kept on ending? It's because the falling action and the resolution took too long. You know that great feeling of those film noirs from the 1940s where James Cagney gets it all sorted out, and we go right to a dark screen, it's over. You have a sense of everything's good. Climax resolution should happen pretty quick. Anyway, this is how the story or the plot line typically is conceived. People perceive that history is moving like this too. But history actually is not necessarily moving like this, because if you zoom in on this plot line and you look at it as happening throughout history, depends on where you're starting from in your mind. If you want to start from a good period and you want to go and tell the story from a good period into a dark period, it looks like tragedy. You can also tell the same story, or a similar story, where you start from a dark period and move to a good period and it looks like comedy. Not humor, but something that turns out well. History looks a lot more like this, where you go up and you go down, and you go up and you go down, and you go up and you go down, and you are somewhere in the middle, and the fogginess of the future has a lot more to do with what we choose to do at any given time. Now, some people are people of religious faith. I myself am. And so you might plot a course where the undulations are sort of going up like this in your mind. But it doesn't mean there aren't going to be troughs and peaks. And some of us believe that everything is going to be progressing, and some of us think that things are getting worse, and some of us think that things are basically running a constant trend line, up and down, up and down. So the optical illusion is that history is like this, and it's just going to keep doing that. It turns out we have to make choices along the way. So I mentioned the Alamo, and I wanted to tell you about Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the prime minister. There you see him shaking the leader of another country's hand. Chamberlain was willing to yield to the dark designs of Hitler's Germany. His successor, Winston Churchill, made a decision that was different than Chamberlain. Churchill told his fellow Britons, and I quote, this is what he said, "I have myself full confidence." I'm not going to try to do my Churchill voice. I can't do Churchill's drama. You can actually hear this, of course, on YouTube if you wanted to. You could pull this speech up. It's well worth doing. One of the great speeches in the entire history of Western civilization. I mean, that's not an exaggeration. One of the 10 speeches you should be familiar with in the entirety of Western civilization, and maybe of those 10, maybe only one of 2 that you can actually hear the speaker delivering it. "I have myself full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the memory of tyranny. If necessary for years, if necessary, alone." At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. Even though large tracts of Europe and many old and famous states have fallen and may fall into the grip of the Gestapo and all the odious apparatus of Nazi rule, we shall not flag or fail. We shall go to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight on the hills. We shall never surrender. If the Texans in the Alamo can fight to the death, and if Churchill's countrymen can take this proud and noble attitude and defy the odds against the Nazis, how is it that even now as we speak, the vast Russian army is abandoning hope in the face of a much smaller Ukrainian army? Or vice versa, how is it the Ukrainian army is persisting? People, in short, have choice, and their choices affect the future. They have the choice to do the right thing and die. They have the choice to look in the dark eyes of evil and not give in. But they also have the choice to surrender to evil. People have choice. History is determined by their choice. Now, there is more for us to deal with on the subject of human choice. One more thing in particular. Some choices get easier to make over time. It is easy today for the ordinary person, people like you and me, to choose not to enslave another person. It's easier. In fact, it is not even an option for most of us today to choose to enslave another person, even if we, in some perverse sense, wanted to. So we can claim little credit personally. We can claim little credit or moral high ground for not being slave owners, since the choice has gotten so easy in our civilization that it is not a choice for us, ordinary people, to make. The people who deserve the credit are not us, but the ones who made that choice long ago, and at great cost, I might add. So some choices get easier to make, while other choices get harder to make. Indeed, sometimes history forces us to choose something that had never been an option before. Consider the subject of marriage and divorce. This is really only a historical observation. I'm not attempting to get into anybody's business, but I want to point out some statistics. Surveys of attitudes about marriage from the early 20th century reveal that the vast majority of couples were satisfied with their marriages in the early 20th century. That is, up until the 1960s. Why? In American law, from the 1800s through the 1960s, divorce was almost never granted except in cases where physical cruelty or adultery could be proven, what they called a divorce for reasons of fault. A fault divorce. But in 1969, California passed the Family Law Act, which introduced the idea of, quote, irreconcilable differences, and thereby invented the idea of a no-fault divorce, which hadn't existed. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, it just hadn't existed as an option in the past. A no-fault divorce. We should not be surprised to find that after this change, more couples began to report in surveys that they were unsatisfied with their marriages. Divorce rates increased from 2.1 divorces for every 1,000 Americans in 1958, 2.1, to 3.2 divorces in 1969, 10 years later, to 5.3 divorces in 1979, yet 10 further years on. Did the number of unhappy couples more than double over 20 years? Possibly, but unlikely. Rather, perceptions changed so that the experiences that were once regarded as normal and satisfactory features of a marriage in the 1950s had become intolerable in the 1970s. Not because the boiling point was the same, but because the boiling point, as it were, changed. People were willing to make a choice based on different attitudes. Once the door is opened in history, it's no surprise to find that people start walking through that door. In our own time, we're beholding this very phenomenon take place in slow motion in all sorts of other areas. Free speech is an area that people are self-moderating their speech, afraid to say things, or afraid to have people say things because of what others might think. So, whereas someone might have said something in the past on a topic that was politically interesting, they might avoid it altogether today. So, when something is not thought of as an option, you don't get much of it. When something becomes harder, or becomes an option, it is harder not to choose that thing, and you get much more of it. And when that option becomes the most recent chapter in the Whig story of liberty's unstoppable progress, the Reformation, the overthrow of monarchies, the abolition of slavery, the suffrage of women, and now you fill in the blank. You take your contemporary issue that you're interested in, and what we do, the Whig fallacy, is to take that, stick it on the back of this domino effect and say it's good because it's the expansion of liberty. It's coming and inevitable because history moves in an inevitable progression. And of course, we like where we stand because we always find ourselves, the latest chapter, to be the good guys in that story. So this is why human freedom shapes the direction of history. And good choices are sometimes easier and sometimes harder to make. This means that history can go for a very long time in a bad direction, but it can change for the good. Or, equally, it can go for a long time in a good direction, and it can change and become wicked. If history in large part depends on our choices, history is neither inevitably getting better, nor is it inevitably getting worse. There is no arc to history. And we have a responsibility to address how we today can shore up the future, especially for our children who are, as Scripture says, far off. Generation upon generation upon generation who are in the future depend on us today, much as we today depend on people who made hard, sacrificial choices to do the right thing long ago. Well, here we come to the subject of education. And let me first acknowledge that almost everything, and it's not an exaggeration, almost everything depends on education. In the home, at the church, and in the schoolhouse. These are the traditional three places where people's souls are formed. Imagine a nation of people who have been formed simply to do what they are told to do. Many of these people are smart. Most of them have achieved requisite levels of aptitude in key skills, literacy, mathematics, etc. All have earned diplomas, as is standard in their culture. But when pressure comes from above or all around, they comply, they fall in line. Even though illogic is the routine feature of public rhetoric, they go on unquestioning and do as they are told. This is the soul of an unfree people. How do you get a nation like Germany doing what the Nazi regime told them to do? We have to ask this question, not just about them, but about ourselves, and about our future children. Such a populace could not choose liberty in 1776. They couldn't have. They couldn't raise up 100 men of valor to fight in the Alamo. So people would slouch and yield to their German cousins such a people would slouch and yield to their German cousins across the English Channel, because having the degree or the skills or the knowledge is not enough. It's not enough to have earned the certificate, to have mastered the techniques, to be able to pass the knowledge test. It's not enough as we think about the future. Let me go back to that. Education, most of all, is about forming souls who can choose to live good lives. I use that phrase very intentionally. Souls who can choose. Some souls cannot choose to do the right thing. They must be told to do a thing. And sometimes that thing that they're told to do isn't very good or is even wicked. But how do we form souls who can choose to do the right thing, not only when it's easy? It's easy not to be a slave owner today. It's not even possible for almost all of us. Not only when it's easy, but when it's hard. A highly skilled coward brings ruin on his fellow soldiers. A well-degreed but imprudent leader makes well-intentioned but disastrous choices. A politician of high and sincere ideals can implement catastrophic policy. And he'll still ask for just a bit more time to see if his theory will pan out. The problem with these people is not their motives necessarily, nor is it their knowledge. And by the way, unfortunately, delivering these comments at any time causes us to think of certain people. You can deliver the same comment 4 years from now or 4 years ago, and it'll echo in your mind. We need politicians at any given time who aren't just making well-intentioned but bad ideas. We need politicians at any time who are making courageous, wise, and good policy. One lacks courage, in my examples, another lacks prudence, another lacks justice. This is one of the most important insights in the classical education movement. This is one of the things that has been forgotten and that is broadly lacking in the education that so many of us, myself included, have received. And this is why the classical education renewal movement, of which you are a part, is so important, and why so many people are opting in. The greatest contribution of classical education, in my opinion, is the reminder that our focus should not be on content transfer, not even on skill acquisition, but first of all on soul formation. Everything depends on that. The information you know is less important than the kind of person you are. And the skills, however important they may be, that you learn are just tools that you will use. A skill in the hand of a good person can be used for the good. You can pick up a hammer and you can knock someone on the head with it. You can also pick up the hammer and you can make beautiful craftsmanship with it. The skill and the knowledge are only as good as the character of the person who possesses them. And that is the insight, I think, which truly distinguishes the classical education renewal movement. So we need to be making sure that with every lesson that we teach in the classroom, during every class period, we are conscious of the habits and virtues we are reinforcing or not into our students. For those of you who have no more space in your curriculum to add a character formation unit, the good news is that character formation is unavoidable. The bad news, however, is that character formation is unavoidable. When we are teaching addition, we are doing character formation. When we are grading an essay, we are doing character formation. Leading a discussion, character formation. Practicing penmanship, yes, character formation. Looking at art, following lab instructions, getting in line, listening to music, it's all character formation. We are either teaching good habits or bad habits, vices or virtues, through the medium of everything else that we do. These are a list of habits from one classically minded educator from about 100 years ago, Charlotte Mason. Her idea, and it's not her idea only, there's a long tradition, is that these habits that are in front of you and many others need to be practiced as behavior modifications that you adopt eventually. And when you have them, you become, what makes them a habit is that you don't have to think about them. I learned late in life, apparently too late, that if you haven't learned to make, there's a study on this, if you haven't learned to make your bed by the time you're 15, you won't be able to independently choose for the rest of your life to make your bed every morning. The way it worked out for me is that I married someone who had learned that lesson. And through a slow process of growth, I'm getting along the way there. But the point is that a person who knows to make their bed when they're 60 isn't getting up and having to make a hard moral choice every morning, because it's in their muscle memory that they do it. That's what a habit is. A habit is something that you don't have to keep choosing to do because it gets down into your bones and it's there for you. You can rely on it. There's also a tradition in the classical world of the cardinal virtues and other virtues. But these four cardinal virtues in particular, I like to think of them as if you pop the hood of the human soul, and you want to understand why something's not working, it's down to one of these four things. If the alignment's off and we're steering off the road, or if we're stalling out when we're at a stop sign, it's going to be one of these four virtues or some combination of them where they're not fitting together properly, something's out of whack. It comes to this. So it's worth studying these. I don't have time to go into detail on what the four cardinal virtues are, but this is a deep insight about the human soul. And whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, whether you're intentional or not, you're either instilling these four virtues into your students, or you're not, which is the opposite, which is you're instilling vice into your students. There is no fence sitting on this. The opposite of a virtue isn't nothing. The opposite of a virtue is a vice. And so we have to be intentional. That's the scary part about education. Unless we're forming virtue, we're forming vice. We're not forming nothing. So I wanted to take a minute and walk you through a few, actually 10, simple things to think about that are character formation positive, that are slanted in a good direction for the classroom. And I want this to be an encouragement to administrators, to parents, just as moms and dads at home, and of course to teachers in the classroom, whether you're in pre-K or you're in 12th grade or you're teaching adults today. The first thing is, instilling habits and virtues is different from naming and defining them. Sometimes we think that if we put the word courage on the board and we explain what courage is, that we are doing our job in character formation. We are not. It's not that it's a bad thing to teach a student what the word courage means, or even teach the student, quote, how to grow in courage. If you explain the process to the student, that's also not forming them. No, you have to understand how courage is actually developed, and they have to go through the process themselves of developing courage. It's very hard to do that. It's very hard to do that because it requires, courage in particular, requires putting people in situations where they are afraid and asking them to do it anyway. Courage is when you do the right thing even though you're afraid. It's a virtue. It's not only a virtue, it's one of the most important virtues. But the only way to develop it is to be put in situations where you have to practice it. Learning about it is not enough. That's just one example. I was very discouraged when I learned that virtue formation worked this way on a personal level. I would love to grow in all these things. Did you know patience requires being around people you don't want to be around? Did you know generosity requires giving away things that you'd rather keep for yourself? The stuff that you don't want, giving it away is just clearing up your house. It's not generosity. If you grow in generosity, it comes by the painful process of giving away something that you'd really rather keep for yourself. And don't even get me started on how to grow in humility. I have a long way to go there, and I have a hunch that it requires some pain too. All virtue formation comes with pain, unfortunately. Instilling habits and virtues is different from reading stories that illustrate good and evil. This too is a good thing, but is not the same as actually instilling the habits and the virtues. So yes, I really want to commend to you developing what they call a moral imagination by reading wonderful literature that dramatizes the good and the evil. And don't cut out the evil. It is trendy today to avoid evil. We have to see evil. We have to, because we have to know what it looks like so that we know how to oppose it and then have courage ourselves. Those of you who are teaching literature, be careful about survey courses. Survey courses are tricky. Survey courses prioritize getting through content rather than soul formation. So in particular, those of you who teach English Lit or even history kind of courses or an art course that's trying to move through a chronological survey. Be careful there. Be careful not to miss the opportunity to shape the soul because you're trying to get on to the next section. They can look it up on Wikipedia. They can look it up in the online encyclopedia because we have all the information that we need at our fingertips. But what they don't have is dedicated time with someone like you to focus on showing them how to be a good person. So don't miss those opportunities. Be careful not to instill the opposite of what you're intending. If we tell students that tidiness will be required in our classroom, but we do not insist on that tidiness, guess what we do? We are actually instilling habits of untidiness in students. First, we are training them to expect there to be a gap between what adults say and what adults do. We are teaching students, when we don't follow through on what we tell them we expect, we're teaching students not to expect grown-ups to follow through. And eventually, when I'm a grown-up, I'll learn that I don't have to follow through. So be careful not to teach the opposite lesson from the one that you want to teach. If we say we want to develop grit or perseverance in a child, but then we always give them ways out when it gets hard, then we are not forming courageous, persevering students. We're forming students who are irresolute and will give up. And will find it an injustice when someone asks them to follow through and to persevere. So be careful about that. I also want you to know that certain disciplines tend to foster specific habits and virtues, and also their opposites. Here's how I think about it. History, I'm a historian by training. History is a wonderful place to learn empathy. It's very, very easy to think that everything's inevitable, but a good historian learns how to put themselves in someone else's shoes from a long time ago and say, pretend that you don't know how it's going to turn out and try to empathize with the decision they had to make. Kennedy, Bay of Pigs invasion, what do? I don't know it's going to turn out okay. Do I make this choice or that choice? And I try to feel the uncertainty. I try to put myself in someone else's shoes. History presents an opportunity to develop empathy. All the disciplines present opportunities like this, different kinds of opportunities. I want to encourage you to look at your discipline and say, or your subject area, and say, what can I specifically inculcate morally in a child by using this discipline? Habits and virtues are always indirectly cultivated. Skills, activities, knowledge and relationships are the medium through which habits and virtues are formed. So, the point here is this. The way that everything that you do in the classroom is an occasion to teach a habit and a virtue. Penmanship learning is an opportunity for a habit and a virtue. Literature, math, it's all there as an opportunity for a habit and a virtue. But the one thing that doesn't teach habits and virtues is teaching habits and virtues. That itself doesn't do it. But it's wonderful when what you say about the character of the soul matches with what you're doing. That's good. That's integrity. But what you're doing, the indirect work of all of your subjects, all of your lessons, and your behavior yourself, is reinforcing and instilling those habits and virtues. That's where the game really gets played. So think of it as sort of a bottom line that's sort of a double bottom line. I'm teaching them math, and I'm teaching them courage. I'm teaching them English, and I'm teaching them attention. Be intentional about the zone of turbulence. The zone of turbulence is the pain. Virtues and habits are formed through adversity. So know in advance, try to know in advance where the hard spot's going to be, and then try to help the child through it, but don't rush in and take the hard away. Be intentional about it. Build that into your lesson plan. Know that that's the spot where the adversity comes. That's the spot where the virtue gets sticky and it grows in the child. Don't take that zone of turbulence away, but at least plan in advance and know it's there. And also let some of the parents know that it's coming. In week 3, there's going to be this essay. Don't come in and take the problem away from them. I've built a lesson plan. I built a course, a curriculum where this gets hard for a minute, and by week 9, it gets a little bit better. Let the child go through the adversity. It's good for them. When we see actions that arise from good or bad habits, virtues or vices, it is good to discuss them with students by using a consistent moral vocabulary. What I mean here is that the word courage should always refer to the same thing throughout your organization and throughout your whole curriculum. And then when something happens, say, "That was great, Sammy, because you demonstrated courage." Wasn't that awesome? So he knows what courage means. All of his peers know what courage means. And it's being reinforced, it's being taught, and it's consistent throughout the organization. Sometimes you and I mean different things by our words. Try to get all on the same page, reinforce, because the education is best when we're all doing the same thing. Provide students with a pantheon of moral excellence. It's good to point students to people who have demonstrated, who are models of outstanding virtue. It's encouraging to know that someone's done it before. It's also fine to use literary examples, even though they didn't really happen, so that we have them in our imagination. Because at the crossroads, when your child, be prepared for a minute, when your child comes to the crossroads in their life, and they have to make a choice between good or evil, do I do the right thing or not? They won't choose the right thing based on an ethics course they had in college. They will choose the right thing because they have a story in their mind that inspires them about their uncle or their aunt, about a story in a piece of literature, or about a moment in history. We need to fill their imagination with examples of how to do the right thing. This whole thing that I'm saying stresses the importance of moral responsibility and personal integrity. Okay? That's what this is all about. When your focus is on instilling virtue and habit, you're actually focusing on the power that the child has to make their life a good life by making choices in their own life. Now, there are all sorts of forces outside of them that can make their life bad. But if we neglect the power that each person has to make good choices, to have integrity, then we neglect the most powerful element of having a good life. And so when we focus on virtue formation, we're actually teaching the students one big lesson, which is that you can shape your own character through hard work, not just on what you're trying to accomplish, but on yourself. And then the last lesson that I'd like to stress is don't be surprised. If you focus on habit and character and virtue, don't be surprised that as habits deepen and virtues become established, performance and achievement levels rise. Because people who do the right thing and who have strong, good habits will perform well. The good news is that if you focus on character, you get academic achievement. If you focus on academic achievement, you often don't get character, and even worse, you start to not get academic achievement. By focusing on the kind of person that you're forming at Thales, you get both. And you start to populate the world with the kind of people who are capable of making the choices that make the future better. Now here's where I want to just close with an encouragement. I don't know if you're aware of this, but Thales Academy is not just a school or just an academy. It is a national model. But the problem with the classical movement at this moment in time is that it's not all fully worked out. We're still developing things. It's very young relative to the public education sector. And so there's still work to do to figure out how to get the character formation part to be built into my lesson plans on calculus. How to get the character formation part into my lesson plans on Charles Dickens. So I want to encourage you at Thales, and I'm talking to the administrators and the teachers alike, recognize that you guys are leaders. You are national leaders and a national model that we're all looking to. And we need you to keep on figuring out how to make it better and better and better, because we're learning from you. Because your role in the national model is so huge. Thank you.